Now to introduce our second speaker, John Fonte. Dr. Fonte is a senior fellow, the director of the Center for American Common Culture at the Hudson Institute. He has his bachelor's and master's degree in history from the University of Arizona and his PhD in world history from the University of Chicago. He's had an illustrious career in public service, working for the federal government in a variety of capacities, including the U.S. Department of Education. He is the author of a book that is absolutely spot on for our topic, Sovereignty or Submission. Will Americans rule themselves or be ruled by others? In the interest of time, I'm going to be brief about this. We may have to collapse our question period at the end here to give Dr. Fonte a half hour.
Thank you. Let's take a look at what we have up here. This is essentially an ad in Foreign Affairs magazine. Of course, is the leading magazines dealing with foreign policy and international relations in the United States. It's an ad for the Center for Global Studies at NYU, New York University. And take a look at it. So as a global citizen, to whom do I pledge allegiance? So the key question you might ask here is, why is there a question mark by the word allegiance? Essentially, allegiance has a political meaning to it too, right? The word allegiance means that you're politically attached. To pledging allegiance implies a political loyalty. In a sense, this is a takeoff on the Declaration of Independence, and also, of course, on the Pledge of Allegiance. That people say, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America," and so on. So this is in a sense, a direct takeoff, and to put a question mark there, in a sense, problematizes or challenges the concept of political loyalty. So it's not, in other words, they're not just talking about international cooperation or world peace. There's actually a political question here. To whom do I pledge allegiance? And so this is a deliberate effort in some ways to problematize the question of political loyalty. Now, President Barry Mills at Bowdoin has, of course, endorsed the idea of global citizenship. He said directly, he asked the question, what are we trying to accomplish here at Bowdoin? Clearly, we want our students to be able citizens in the global community. Our goal should be that these young people should start on a path where they can acquire the skills and knowledge to be able global citizens. And President Mills tells essentially the bureaucracy at Bowdoin College, he says, I remind all of our organizations, that's within Bowdoin, to think about what is required to become a global citizen. And he says, if we continue to do our job as educators, our students will be prepared to embark on lives and careers as global citizens. So he continues to mention this, and in his response to the National Association of Scholars' critique, he said, again, we are committed in preparing to have students be global citizens. So this is repeated a bunch of times. Now, let's put this idea of global citizenship in context with what's going on today. Today there's a broad-based political, intellectual, legal movement throughout the world, particularly in the West, to essentially promote the idea of global governance. And to undermine the idea of the democratic state, and this would include certainly the democratic state, the liberal democratic nation state. Now, promoting global governance is not the same thing as world government. Nobody serious is talking about promoting a world government at this point, but people who are serious are talking, this is not simply airy-fairy, but they are serious, are talking about promoting global governance. And this idea is in the air, certainly among the world's elites when they gather at places like Davos, or The Hague, or the UN headquarters in Manhattan. This is the term you hear. How do we achieve global governance? I mean, this goes from world leaders to business leaders like Bill Gates. What they're saying essentially, the phrase you hear often is the nation-state system is obsolete. Well, in fact, let me ask you, how many have heard the term global problems require global solutions? Who's heard that term? Just about everybody in the room has heard that term. Well, the serious people involved in this are not talking about a world government or something like this. They're talking about a form of post-national governance. It's actually in effect today. If you look at the European Union, this is how things operate in Europe. Let's say you're a citizen of Great Britain. So you elect your local member of parliament. He's supposed to carry out the laws in Britain. But actually in Britain today, 60 to 80% of the laws that the British have to follow and are created in Brussels by the European Commission, which is not even the European Parliament. The European Commission is a bureaucracy. And then the final rule of law comes from the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights. The British recently tried to repatriate a suspected terrorist to Jordan, and he was the Parliament was overruled in a sense by the European Court of Human Rights. There's an argument now exactly as what's happening, but the British are paying attention because they're supposed to follow the European Court of Human Rights. Now, here in this country, the American Bar Association has talked about promoting the global rule of law. And they said, well, the Constitution would still be fine. It was just part of the Constitution. But when you think about what's happened in Britain, what's happened in many countries in Europe, in other words, there's a supranational court above the national courts. In our case, that would be above the Supreme Court. So this is so I'm saying it's serious, at least at the level of governance, not government. So that is, in a sense, what I think is happening. And I want to, if you don't mind, plug my book, Sovereignty or Submission, which you can easily get on Amazon. And this tells the struggle of the worldwide struggle that's going on today in the 21st century between the liberal democratic nation states, and that would include the United States, it would include Israel, it would include people in Britain who are trying to retain their sovereignty, versus really the forces of global governance, which would be forces in every country, including this country, as I mentioned, the American Bar Association. So this is a serious issue and a major issue in international politics that we're faced with today. Well, how is this related to the American University and to what we're talking about today here at Bowdoin? Well, the question for Bowdoin, one thing I want to say was the struggle today on global governance is not traditional liberal internationalism. This is not Franklin Roosevelt's Four Freedoms. It's not Harry Truman and the Marshall Plan. That was American internationalism. That was the American nation state involved in world affairs. Now, what NYU could have promoted was we have a global program which is about realistic international politics today. It includes, we want to help and assist American students prepare to be citizens in the world of the 21st century. That does mean participation in world affairs, but as American citizens promoting world affairs. If you're a foreign student visiting NYU, that's fine. Essentially, this is a course, and you'll also understand how nation-states interact with the global community. So, my point here, excuse me, is that this is not traditional internationalism as we've understood it. It is transnationalism or globalism, something beyond that. So why didn't President Barry Mills could have simply said, well, we're internationalists. That's what we've always done. As America's been involved in world affairs. Why would they choose to move beyond internationalism, perfectly respectable liberal policy, and move to globalism? And I say the answer is ideology. Give me a little glass of water here. The answer is ideology. Now, the National Association of Scholars critique talked about a progressive ideology. I would expand that. I would take a slightly different approach and suggest that, yes, it is a progressive ideology, but it is a particular type of progressive. It's transnational progressive as opposed to, or global progressive, as opposed to national progressive. I'm going to give you an example of a national progressive in a little while. But let's look at American campuses as we were discussing. Let's look at what's going on a little bit, as Casey did in the previous section, in American history. Linda Kerber was president of the American Historical Association and president of the Organization of American Historians. In her presidential address at the OAH, Organization of American Historians, she said, "Do we need citizenship? We are embedded in post-national and transnational relationships that may be changing the meaning of citizenship beyond recognition." Professor Kerber answers his rhetorical question by saying we need new types of citizenship that are transnational and postnational. One of the leaders of the American Historical Association's efforts on this issue, Professor Thomas Bender at NYU, said we have to transnationalize American history, which is a big project of the American Historical Association. It represents professors of history in the United States. Well, why do we have to transnationalize American history? Professor Benders wrote, the purpose, and this is a direct statement from him, is to change the core American narrative. To change the core American narrative. To, quote, to better educate us and our children in the kind of cosmopolitanism that makes us better citizens of both the nation and the world. Well, I submit this is political. This is a political agenda. It's presented in the following way. This is how this is presented. Today, post-national and we live in a post-national and interdependent world. This is what they say, which requires almost with a capital R, requires schools to transnationalize American history. In other words, university leaders do not say, my political preference is to transnationalize American history. The times require it. So it's presented in descriptive terms, not in normative terms, not in value terms. It's really a political agenda presented in these terms of something that is simply going with the times. The president of the University of Pennsylvania, Amy Gutmann, is what I would certainly call a transnational progressive or a global progressive. And she wrote, it is repugnant that American students see themselves as primarily as citizens of the United States rather than as what she calls the universal human. I'll just repeat that. It is repugnant that American students see themselves primarily as students of the United States. Well, that is what I call transnational progressivism. Now, by way of comparison, let's listen to the rhetoric of what I would call national progressivism, the old style progressivism. And this would be the words of the most progressive president of the 20th century, Franklin D. Roosevelt, that he delivered on June 6, 1944, in a radio address to the nation. He said, I'll just read a little of this, Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day set forth on a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. And then he continues, success will not come with rushing speed, but we will return again and again. And we know that by thy grace and by the righteousness of our cause, our sons will triumph. Well, unlike today's transnational progressives, D-Day and the war on Nazi totalitarianism was not seen by national progressives, such as Franklin Roosevelt. As some university leaders today see 9/11 and the war on radical Islamist terrorism as primarily an opportunity to understand other cultures. Franklin Roosevelt wasn't saying, well, yes, the Germans there's a great culture out there in Goethe and Beethoven. Of course, that's true, but it probably wasn't apropos at that time. Now, there's a counter. In other words, there's a counter argument in favor of an education that is consistent with democratic self-government and national identity. Natan Sharansky was a famous Soviet dissident and clearly head of the Jewish Agency, and he has made the point that a strong national identity and attachment to a particular way of life is essential to self-government, to democratic self-government. I'll quote Sharansky here for a moment. He says, "Democracy offers a vision of opportunity and self-determination and peace. But without a particular way of life and a set of commitments to live for, the democratic vision inevitably loses force, becoming incapable of even defending the values that it holds most dear." Now, Sharansky also says that patriotism is required. He doesn't even shy away from the word nationalism, using it in the sense of liberal democratic nationalism. So here is Sharansky again. "Nationalism has been a powerful weapon to defend the free world against aggression. During the Second World War, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Charles de Gaulle gave their peoples hope and strength by appealing to the history, tradition, and national values of their own countries. They drew upon their nation's unique past to help them secure its future." Well, and the problem with the European Union today is that there's no demos, there's no European people, so there's no democracy. There are no really committed European citizens. Well, I suppose there are 60 or 70,000 bureaucrats in Brussels who are committed European citizens, but there's not so many other leaders, and even the leaders of the European Union admit that they have a democracy deficit. But so today, the liberal democratic nation state is under challenge throughout the world from above, from this, what we've been talking about, globalism and transnational progressivism, and below, from multiculturalism and coercive diversity. I'm going to speak for a moment because these two are related, and related to our topic today at the American University. Certainly the single most important concept in contemporary academic ideology, which is described in the NAS report, is diversity. So what is diversity? Well, we should distinguish between the diversity that is the result of a free society and the diversity that is the goal of society. Diversity that's the result of a free society is simply the result of free choices of individual citizens and the robust interplay of voluntary institutions of civil society. Certainly a vibrant civil society contains diverse institutions, individuals, viewpoints, neighborhood associations, civic groups, charitable institutions, churches, clubs, ethnic associations, religious associations, veterans groups, women's groups, fraternal organizations, sports and leisure groups, health clubs. This has been acknowledged since Tocqueville's visit to the United States in the 1830s. It's been acknowledged as a part of a healthy pluralism, a diversity of American civic life. But the goal, diversity as a goal of society is essentially coercive diversity. As a practical matter, in government, universities, employment, culture, media, all the different sections of society, diversity is defined in terms of groups, ascribed groups, racial, ethnic, gender, other groups that you're born into, not groups that you choose voluntarily. And how do we recognize, or how do we advance diversity? How do we know we're achieving diversity? Well, the answer is always look at the numbers. How many women, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and so on, have we hired, employed, retained, admitted, graduated, whatever the case may be? What should be their numbers in proportion to their percentage of the local population? At the end of the day, the standard measurement for achieving diversity is always statistical equality for groups in all aspects of society. So if women make up 51% of the country, then or let's say the local labor force, then 51% of all doctors, lawyers, accountants, congressmen, and so on should be women. That's what we've heard. That's the approach. Of course, this diversity. Well, let me say this: it can't be emphasized enough that the diversity that American universities and elites in general are constantly touting, are constantly promoting, are not the genuine. It's not the genuine diversity that emerges from a free, pluralistic society. Instead, it is the ideology of coercive diversity that is maintained through federal government mandates of ethnic and gender preferences in employment and education, numerical goals and de facto quotas, and the official legal status actually of protected classes. This undermines the American ideals of equality under the law and equality of opportunity. If one logically followed this rationale of the diversity project, let's say 51% women, so we have to have 51% in all aspects of life, every employment, every education, and so on. If we actually did that, this would be incompatible with a free society. Hence, a free society is free society versus a diverse society. At least the way diversity is presently being defined, and that's why I use the term coercive diversity. Remember, Herbert Marcuse talked about repressive tolerance. Well, I'm talking about coercive diversity. Now I'm going to go go to the last chart here. This, I'll end up with this. If you want a sort of a glimpse of the culture war on one page, this is it to an extent. On one side is sort of a traditional liberal arts education and the norms that were probably predominant in the country for most of the 200 years. And on the other side is the ideology, this academic ideology we've been talking about, what I call transnational progressivism or global progressivism. And we can see quickly how there's sort of this contrast. So at the top, I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can get the idea, and you can, of course, keep this. One is an emphasis on one, and one side there's emphasis on the other. One side the emphasis on the American citizen, the other side the emphasis on the global citizen. I use this American people and American peoples because we always hear we the people of the United States. Well, in the 1990s, the history department at UCLA that we've heard a little bit about created the national standards for high school, national standards in U.S. history, and they referred to the American peoples, not the American people. So that was in the UCLA history standards created by history professor Gary Nash. So that we the peoples of the United States. So the idea, of course, that we're all different peoples allied to multiculturalism with different values, perspectives. So that's where I got that term. And then we can look at different things. On one side, you see voluntary diversity, you think in terms of voluntary associations. But essentially, what's being promoted today in universities, Bowdoin and elsewhere, are diversity of ascribed groups. So you're born into a racial, ethnic, gender category. So you think of someone like, say Helen Keller. Is she primarily a woman, or is she somebody who accomplished something as a human being? She was born into a category, but it was what she accomplished on her own that is probably what she's best known for. I contrast. We hear a lot today that we're a multicultural nation. Are we a multicultural nation, or are we a multi-ethnic nation with perhaps subcultures, ethnic subcultures of Italians and Poles and Jews and Latinos? These aren't entirely separate nations. Yes, there are certain customs that are retained, but I would say it's primarily multi-ethnic with perhaps a multi-subcultural rather than multicultural. A few other points here, and then I'll stop. Say free society does contrast with a diverse society. Then I mentioned a few points of the study of history here, and this also comes from the National History Standards. We've traditionally thought of, well, the United States, what became the Republic of the United States was essentially formed by colonists coming from Europe, from essentially from Britain, at least beginning in Britain, and later from elsewhere. But this was the beginning of the political formation of the United States. So, does American history begin with Europeans discovering America, or is it, as the national history standards tell us, with three worlds meeting? Are we thinking here of British constitutional heritage, or are we thinking of the convergence of three worlds? Now, this came from the national history standards. The idea was to sort of de-Europeanize, de-Westernize American history. The idea is, well, the ideas didn't really come from, the Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution and these events that happened in Britain or in Western Europe. They came from a meeting of three worlds. The three worlds would be the European world, the Amerindian world, the Native Americans who were here at the time, and West Africa, the African slaves who were taken. So this convergence of three worlds, which to an extent has some truth to it, but it's not really the political forms. The same thing is important when the European settlement started, or it's important when hunters crossed the Bering Strait in Alaska. And that was really the beginning. Well, it was the beginning of what was happening on the North American continent, but it wasn't really the beginning of the United States in the sense of citizenship. So these are some of the questions that you can tease out from these simple phrases. And as I say, at the end then, America is, America has been, or the other vision, the current academic vision, is sort of America will be. It's a utopian type vision. We're going to create a multicultural global society where authority is given to higher global legal and administrative apparatus. And I'll close with this note. Well, on one side, as I say, this is essentially transmitting the American regime and improving upon it, and the other is total transformation of the regime. And I'll close on this note. President Mills, one of his comebacks to the NAS, to the National Association of Scholars' critique, was, well, they accuse us of being anti-American. We're not anti-American. And I think that's true. I don't use the term anti-American to describe this project, the global governance project. But what it is post-American. They're not saying there is some anti-Americanism, obviously, in some of the teachers and some of the professors, the comments that Casey was talking about, and some of the ones I read. But the mainstream is probably a post-American. Post meaning after America. Well, America was fine for its day, but now we're moving to global leadership. Even the American Bar Association is saying we want a global rule of law. Well, that's post-Constitution. It's after the Constitution. So it's part of the postmodernism, I guess, we now have post-American. So I would call this ideology a post-American ideology. And I'm going to stop there.